be giving this talk. Because as I said, when I came to do this, well, first let me give the outline. So I'm going to talk about analogies, the use of the analogies from ecology to try and make those not just analogies, but actually turn it into a quantitative theory that can be used to do useful things about problems like financial monitoring and regulation. The main point of the talk that I want to get across is that the intellectual framework from ecology can be usefully imported into economics to give understanding of essential dynamics underlying financial crises. So I'm hoping to try and convince you of that, but to make it clear what I'm not talking about, I'm not talking about the kind of interactions of humans with a biological environment that, say, Michel Leroux talked about earlier today. I'm very interested in that. Actually, I'm actively trying to work on that, but that's not what I'm talking about today. Though I think it's I think it's also true, though, that if we brought the theory in economics closer in its conceptual view to ecology, a lot of the problems that happen when you have interactions between economists and biologists in this camp would be much easier to resolve. I'm also not going to talk about analogies to ecology in the real economy and, say, in input-output networks. My collaborator, Francesco Caravelli, who is there, we'll be talking about that tomorrow if anybody's interested in that. That does actually relate more directly to this first topic. Now, let me just say that the material I'm going to cover today is substantially covered by, in a very old paper now, Market Force Ecology and Evolution, that appeared in the Journal of Industrial and Corporate Change. Now, it's a bit of a strange place for a paper on finance to appear. The reason for that is because I wrote this paper really starting about 95. I posted it on the web in 98. The paper represented my view of how markets work after noticing the dichotomy between the academic literature that I was actively reading at the time and my conversations with traders and the way traders viewed the world and the vast difference. So I tried to make a theory that was more like what traders said and did. I was influenced, for example, by George Soros's book, The Alchemy of Finance, not so much by his ideas about reflexivity as rather just the view that he gives there. He gives a diary of his trading over a year's period of time, and you see that what he had was a view of who the main players in the market were, how they affected each other. He made contingencies of if this guy does this, then the Treasury will react this way and prices will go that way. So he was thinking about, he wouldn't quite say it this way, the ecology of the market. And I found over and over again that traders tend to look at the market that way. There's a somewhat more modern version of the story in this paper that was a driver review for the Foresight Committee on the Study of Future of Computer Trading. Jean-Pierre, I have a feeling, was one of the ones who invited me to be involved in that. Preparing this talk made me realize I actually need to write an updated version that takes into account all this stuff I've learned that's longer and more depth than this one. So that's what I'm trying to give a preview of in this talk. Now I just want to give a little background. There's already been a lot of talk about efficiency. I want to just remind everybody in the room, because we have a lot of non-economists, that what that means. First of all, there's two forms of efficiency. One of them is informational. It's not possible to consistently make excess returns, or stronger version, there's no risk-free arbitrage. So you can say this in various ways, but it has to do with the ability of agents in the market to make big profits. And in its strong form, or in this form, it basically says you shouldn't be able to do that. Now, the other one is allocative efficiency, that is utilities maximized, at least in some sense, which is much more about what's good for the world. It's about social welfare. And under perfect rationality, complete markets, equilibrium, long list of several assumptions, you can show that markets will be efficient in both these senses. But as soon as you start chipping away at the assumptions, these things are no longer moving in lockstep, and you can have markets that might be quite informationally efficient that wouldn't be allocatively efficient. Now, I should say that this is kind of the disease that got me into this whole business. I specifically remember driving on the Mass Parkway with my, at the time, brother-in-law, Cookie Gibb, who was an investment banker, Harvard MBA, working at First Boston. So he's a trader. And he told me about the efficient market hypothesis, which I've never heard of. I remember Burt Malkiel and the random walk and so on. And I said, that's got to be impossible. And that what got the bee in my bonnet, actually, to go the whole direction I did, because I like challenges. Now, let me just go on from there. I'll follow up on that a little bit. Because I'm going to argue that market ecology springs out of the deviations from efficiency, it helps to begin by thinking about the kind of intuitive arguments people were using in the old days. This is a statement by Paul Kuttner from 1964 that's quoted in Eugene Fama's review on efficiency, very famous review from 1970. And so he says, if any substantial group of buyers thought prices were too low, their buying would force up prices. Reverse would be true for sellers. Only price changes would occur those that result from new information. New information, almost by definition, should be non-random, or should be random, and so stock prices should be random. Now, and so there, just to recapitulate the argument, you start by imagining a real economy that has a financial system, people are borrowing money, but there's no arbitrageurs around. You would expect things to be pretty inefficient. But somehow the arbitrageurs come in and they start making bets on things, and under the sort of argument that Kuttner says, that should make all these inefficiencies go away. Well, does it, or can it? There's a little catch there, which I think Friedman originally noted, and it was amplified in a paper by Grossman Stiglitz in about 1981. And it's that market efficiency requires arbitrageurs, from the argument by Kuttner, but if there's no way to make profits, what are the arbitrageurs are going to, I mean, after all, that's what's motivating them, they should all just go home. So there must be some residual profits there for those guys to make. And empirically, and I can say this from personal experience, people on Wall Street or the city make much bigger salaries than other people doing comparable jobs. I mean, in my case, I made about an average of 30 times as much per year while I worked at Prediction Company as I did before or after. And by the way, Prediction Company was a company that we started, and I'll say a little more about that in a moment. So it was, there's a lot of money to be made in financial markets. I don't think that surprises anybody. And it's interesting to go back and look at the history of this. The early statements by people like Eugene Fama were quite strong. You can't do this, period. In fact, when Prediction Company was starting up, we actually got substantial press, which was very useful because we were trying to attract a partner because we recognized we didn't know much about financial markets. So we said, we're scientists, we want to team up with bankers, and so we were looking for partners. We got some press, and one of the popular science magazines had an article about us where they called Eugene Fama and asked him, well, what are the odds these guys will succeed? He said, the odds are not zero, but they are very, very low. And so why did he even give us a non-zero probability? Because there's a millionth monkey hypothesis that, well, of course, if you have enough monkeys and they can type, even if it's random, they will eventually type, a sentence of Shakespeare. And so that was, I think, the sense in which he was willing to give us a non-zero chance. The thinking has shifted on that now. I think the empirical evidence is sufficiently strong from places like Renaissance. We add to that. Many other companies add to that. I mean, Prediction Company now has a Sharpe ratio of 3. I'll explain what that means in a minute. Over a 15 or 20-year period now. So the odds that would happen from a million monkeys are zero. So I think we actually accomplished that challenge. But the way I would look at this, I have to say, there were moments when I was, say, 3 or 4 years into doing this where I thought maybe Fama was right. Markets are pretty darn efficient. Don't kid yourself, it's not easy to make money in markets. So the way as a physicist I would say this, that they're informationally efficient at first order, but necessarily inefficient following the Friedman paradox at second order. And it's that second order inefficiency that I'm going to talk about here and investigate its characteristics. So now, suppose you're interested in market failures, like the recent financial crisis we had. How do you go about doing that? So the neoclassical approach would be you take the perfect theory that I mentioned a bit ago and you'd start relaxing assumptions. You'd say, well, we've got institutional constraints. Some banks can do this, other banks can't. We have incomplete markets. You can't hedge all risks. Different people have different information. And so you do put in some kind of specialization to the problem. You put structure into it. But then you operate otherwise in the same framework as before. The market ecology approach, I will argue, you acknowledge those deviations from efficiency at the beginning and investigate their consequences in a much more direct manner. And a key to this is specialization. An idea that in economics goes all the way back to Adam Smith's 1776 treatise and the famous description of the pen factory, where if you recall, he observed that when in making pens, one person would make the shaft, another person would sharpen the pen, another person would make the cap, somebody else would attach the cap to the shaft. And so there was specialization even in such a basic thing as making a pen. And it's a core concept in ecology. After all, ecology is all about different organisms that do very different things and their interactions with each other and the whole that they form, all acting as specialists, or perhaps some of them, as Stefano said earlier, act as generalists, but the differences between those organisms are essential in thinking about ecology from the outset. This is in contrast to rationality. Rationality, if once an agent's rational, in the typical model at least, they can sort of do everything for free. You know, they can be good at this and they can be good at that, and unless you build in restrictions like institutional constraints or information asymmetries, they can do everything else by assumption. So it's a little bit, I think, you know, one needs to think back to why specialization occurs, why it is that, you know, we don't have animals that are really good at swimming and really good at flying and can run fast and think really well and have a culture and do everything at once. Another thing that deserves comment is in most standard economic models, like standard macro models, there's a representative agent who, say, one agent will represent all the diverse agents in the economy, and there's now a growing literature on nonlinear systems. I mean, that works fine when you have a linear system. It can lead to dramatically wrong answers when you have a nonlinear system. Now, okay, what do I mean by the market ecology hypothesis? That agents follow strategies that are specialized to exploit niches corresponding to inefficiencies generated by the activity of other agents. And just to comment, there's a cost benefit at a prediction company that discovered, and that there are increasing returns to specialization. Every year we would think, what are we going to do next year? And we put all our ideas on the board, and we'd have all these great ideas for doing cool stuff, but in the end, the only things we could ever choose were things that were pretty close to what we were doing already. Why? Because the cost to get there was way lower than the cost of doing these other things. If we stayed close to something that used the expertise that we already had, we could quickly construct a plan to, you know, produce something within a quarter or two, which is what we needed to do. And by the way, I wanted to make a side comment, so I'm going to go back a slide concerning Torsten's talk. And I meant to say, I mean, I thank to Torsten that what I'm presenting here is in the same philosophical spirit. I agree on most things. Torsten was finding that in his models, everybody's converging to one strategy. I think that's a very interesting result. I have other models where we see the same thing happening, but empirically, that's not how it is. I was really struck when I bought my suit to go to Wall Street, start knocking on the door of all these firms, and I visited during the course of 1991-92 at least 20 different Wall Street firms, and I was really struck that they were all different. The cultures are different, the way they go about making money is different, they're all specialized and highly diverse. It's not that you can't find pairs or, you know, triples of firms that are very similar to each other, but I was struck by the diversity, and I'm still puzzled. I think it's actually one of the open questions I'll come back to later. Why is there so much diversity? Okay, back to my hypothesis here. I'm going to talk about how we can organize agents into a market food web that specifies who profits from whom, how the market food web evolves with time and the forces that make that happen, how the evolution of new strategies can unbalance that food web, and those imbalances can drive market crises. So let me just state the analogy with biology. This is mainly so that if you're a biologist, you can just think about what we're doing here. I'm not arguing in any sense that biological ecologies are just like market ecologies. I'm just arguing that some of the conceptual tools from biology can be imported, and when you listen to me talk, it may help to think about the following mapping, in which species are trading strategies, the way I look at the world. Individual organisms are traders, and there can be many traders following the same strategy. That's an important thing. There's the population in biology, which is how many animals of a given type are there, turns into how much capital is invested in a given strategy, which I'll sometimes just refer to the size of the strategy. The free energy that organisms gather, the food, is money. The niche is an inefficiency, because the inefficiency gives something that an agent can exploit to make money. Selection is capital allocation. Strategies that end up with lots of money invested that grow in size are successful. Strategies that are not successful lose all their money. Genetic variation is the creation of new strategies, and the carrying capacity of a given strategy is the maximum profits that strategy can get in a given context. Now, Torsten already gave some examples of market strategies. I have a somewhat different set here. Liquidity demanders, which we shouldn't forget about. Fundamentalists, technical traders, prediction company, we were more or less stat arb, although with some differences. Various other things that have arb, which means arbitrage. Statistical arbitrage is what we did. Market makers, derivatives dealers. The people we made our original deal with were a company called O'Connor & Associates. They were derivatives dealers. So what did they do for a living? They sold derivatives to people, and their edge was that they were very good at pricing those derivatives, so they could sell them at a price that was favorable to them. So there are all these different groups, each specialized in their own activity. Now, the trophic web comes from the fact that if a strategy makes increased profits due to the presence of another strategy, then in some sense it's feeding on that strategy. That is, having that strategy there is good for it. The fact that the other strategy is there means that it makes more profits. And there's a test, if you want to map out a trophic web, you could, at least in a model, you can do a armchair experiment where you increase the size of strategy A, you give it more capital, you measure a little bit more capital, you measure the change in the returns of strategy B. What is increasing the size of that strategy A, do the returns of strategy B, and then you can reverse and do the opposite. You increase the size of strategy B and look at the returns on strategy A. So if you see that A suffers, meaning its returns drop, when B gets bigger, and vice versa, then those strategies are competing with each other, because each would prefer that the other wasn't there. If, on the other hand, you see that A benefits from B, meaning its returns go up, but B's returns go down when you increase the population of A, then you have a predator-prey relationship, in which A is like the fox and B is like the rabbit. And finally, you could at least conceive of mutualistic relationships in which A benefits from B and B benefits from A. It's not actually obvious to me whether that actually occurs in economic settings, but I believe it does. Now, I wanted to comment, there was a question from somebody over in that corner, I don't know whether they're there anymore, about density dependence in economics earlier. And in particular, well, I said yes, there's density dependence when supply and demand functions are nonlinear. So if you think about this kind of system, and I'll come back to this, I'll amplify on this in a bit, as it's quite possible that these relationships will change as the size of strategies A and B change. That is, they're context dependent, which is what density dependence is in ecology, I would argue. It's precisely analogous to that. And it's related to the nonlinearity in the supply and demand functions. All right. So now, what are examples of trophic relationships? Well, you could have, for example, I could prove in this paper that short-term trend followers have a predator-prey relationship with long-term trend followers. Now, this actually, let's say, corrected a common mistake that was made. People often assume that trend following is just self-reinforcing. If you're a trend follower, the more the better. The more of us there are, the more profits we're going to make. But actually you can show if the other trend followers are doing just what you're doing, well, they have market impact too. They eat into your market impact. They drive your profits down. It's just like taking a single agent and making them bigger. But in contrast, if you have long-term trend followers, what happens? Let's suppose at random there's some glitch. Markets move up for whatever reason. That activates the short-term trend followers. They then set a trend, they amplify the current trend, and now you engage slightly longer-term trend followers and slightly longer-term trend followers. And if you have a population of trend followers of varying timescales, you can get a big trend going by having the snowball start rolling, but you actually need trend followers at diverse timescales. And when you investigate, you'll see that the short-term trend followers are profiting from the presence of the longer-term trend followers because they're doing what in the trade is called front running. That is, they're getting in ahead, they're getting their trades in ahead of the other guys. And since buying tends to push the market up, they buy first, they push the market up, the market keeps going up, and they profit because they end up buying at the lowest price. Similarly, in models, you can see that fast fundamentalists have predator-prey relationships with dumb or slow fundamentalists. I'll talk about a model that has that property later. And trend followers and value investors together, though, have a more complicated relationship because, for instance, it's a known fact that large value investors often trade quite slowly because they're large. And, they trade slowly in two senses. It takes somebody like Warren Buffett. They buy positions and they hold them for 5 years, typically. That means they can afford to buy their way into those positions very slowly. In fact, Warren Buffett, a couple of years ago, was given a variance by the SEC from reporting his trades, which are required for mutual funds to be done quarterly, because he said it was going to take him more than 9 months to work his way into that trade. He was buying 3.5% of IBM. So he was consistently buying IBM under the radar for more than 9 months, to the point where he had to go to the SEC and get a variance, which they gave him. And then he finally reported it. But it just shows how long these things can be. Anyway, that can trigger trends. But in contrast, or not in contrast, at the same time, trend followers are good for value investors because they make bubbles. And if you didn't have bubbles, you wouldn't have big excursions away from fundamental values. If prices always sit at fundamental values, then there's no opportunity for fundamentalists to trade. So they like it when, at least in the long run, when others drive prices away. Now in the short run, that hurts them because that can be a long time, and fundamentalists can lose a lot of money while trend followers are running prices up. And we saw this happen in a very dramatic way in the tech bubble of the late 90s, where the bubble went on for 4 or 5 years, and the fundamentalists were losing market power because money flowed out of fundamentalist-based strategies into growth strategies until the crash happened in 2000, or the market turned. Now, by the way, I want to give a little aside. Technical trading has always been a bit of a puzzle in economics. And Torsten in his model noted that he said everybody should be a fundamentalist. Well, that again goes against the empirical facts in that there are a lot of firms that do technical trading. In fact, one of the things that struck me at Prediction Company, I interviewed some traders. Traders are surprisingly willing to talk about what they do and how they do it. I'd interview some guys and they'd say, I believe in fundamentals. I don't even look at anything about prices other than the current price level, because I don't believe in any of that stuff. Technical traders would tell you, I don't believe the fundamentalists know anything, all that balance sheet stuff's a bunch of crap. I just look at charts, I make my money doing that, I'm doing very well, thank you. So the fundamentals are sort of obvious why those guys would be there and what their role is in the market. The technical traders is less obvious. So I just wanted to make an aside about that because I don't know the exact numbers, but I would guess there's the order of $500 billion of profits are made by technical traders So it's a big industry. So I just want to say it's a form of, this is the way we viewed it at Prediction Company, state space reconstruction, which goes back to a paper that actually was my third paper in my career with my partner at Prediction Company, Norman Packard. I'm et al. We wrote in 1980 that basically shows if you have a single time series from a dynamical system, it could be an ecology or it could be anything else, but some kind of deterministic dynamical system, you can apply transformations to that time series, like taking the derivative or looking at lag versions of the time series, use it to reconstruct a state space, and then use the reconstruct state space to make predictions, as I did in this paper in 1987, which is how you can actually use chaos to make good short-term predictions, which again is, it's the other culprit that got me into this business, because once I did that, every time I would talk about my work in this, some clown in the audience would always say, have you applied this to the stock market? I kid you not, I never gave a talk in which that question was not asked. And so in 1991, I got sick of the question and quit my job at Los Alamos and decided to try it. So our view of Prediction Company is that technical trading rules just form a highly evolved set of signal processing filters. We actually tested them all and incorporated refined versions of them, and we use them in our models. It's something that I think econometricians don't actually fully understand. Now, let me just make the side comment at the same time that I think most technical trading rules are have little social welfare associated with their use. And that's one of the reasons I quit doing what I did. I felt like in 1999 I'd rather, on my deathbed, be able to say I did something that might be useful for the world than that I, made 10 times as much money as I could ever sensibly spend. Now, you should be asking by this point, where do these inefficiencies come from? If we're going to have a trophic web, we've got to have something at the bottom of that web to drive it. I mean, for the biological world, it's the sun, or it's chemical potential in the earth. Where do inefficiencies come from in financial markets? Well, they come from real economic activity. Go back to the proto-world, I imagine, where you didn't have any arbitrageurs, there's going to be a lot of patterns there. And so those patterns are driving the whole ecology. So, for example, liquidity demanders behaving in synchronous manner, diversification, which I'll say something about in a moment, people who are borrowing for some kind of fundamental reason. Those are the kind of generating inefficiencies that support a rich ecology of predatory investors. So, for example, portfolio rebalancing. Completely standard thing. You have a mutual fund. You at the beginning of the year say, our target is to have the following weights of these stocks. You go along and one of the stocks goes shooting up. Now in dollar terms, your weight on that stock is much bigger. So what do? You rebalance your portfolio by selling that stock. Well, that actually has two consequences. One is it imparts strong correlations between stocks. And now the standard explanation in neoclassical economics would be that it's because there's common information for stocks. Actually, US stocks, for example, 50% of the variance in the prices is common, that is, it's driven by the market. Another 20 to 30% is driven by the industry, and there's only about 20% of the movement of the stock that's actually idiosyncratic to that stock. So the standard explanation would be stocks march in lockstep because there's common information about the economy. I actually think the biggest effect is portfolio rebalancing. But I have to say, at Prediction Company, I never knew what was driving the strategy we did, which was to hedge out all of these common movements of stocks, make bets on the idiosyncratic movement, and basically when the stock price went up, we would assume it was going to go back down. When it went down, we would assume it was going to go back up. And so we came up with ways of betting in that in just the right way. And we made quite a nice profit from doing that. But in hindsight, I think for the work of people like Ramakant, who's at Imperial, you can see that this portfolio rebalancing must be the driver for stat-arb profits. Now, another comment is that I think nobody unfortunately has ever constructed a trophic web. But I'm just guessing, I think most of the ecology is populated by the predators, that is, not the people doing the fundamental activities, speculators feeding off of that. At least most of the ecology in terms of who you would, put on the board and track. I would guess the typical depth of the trophic web is the order of 3 to 4. That is, if you just think about, say, the example I just gave, you have fundamental economic activity, you have mutual funds, and you have stat arb funds. So there's roughly a depth 3 movement. But at the same time, I think there's also a lot of cross reactions and so on. Now, I put a star by basal species, and by the way, I had to correct my spelling. When I first wrote that down, I actually spelled it B-A-S-E-L. And I realized I was just so used to thinking about, systemic risk that Basel II was in. So I actually had to look up the spelling because it's, I wrote this paper a while ago. Basel species aren't quite the same as noise traders. That is, in economics papers, once, interestingly, starting really with Grossman and Stiglitz, people realized that you often had to put in somebody who would be the noise trader, the dummy, that the rational guys could exploit to get reasonable results about a lot of things. So the noise trader in those papers is serving the role of a basal species. I don't want to call it a noise trader, though, because actually, typically, I just think that the name gives the wrong kind of impression. Now, let me just say something now about inefficiencies. So I said we had a stat arb fund. What did our predictive power look like? So this is a plot. This is one of the few things we became what amounted to a prop trading. We were independent of UBS while I was there. We didn't get sold to UBS until 2006, quite a bit after I left. But we were acting as essentially we were trading their money. And so we were like a prop trading group, even though we weren't part of them. Now, originally, the data we had corresponds, in this picture here, we have dates, so I have 23 years. The y-axis here represents the correlation of a prediction formulated by our strategy with the subsequent market movement over the next week. Okay? And so if it says 15, that means we had a 15% correlation between our prediction and what the idiosyncratic movement of that stock was over the next week. So this is a measure of how good our predictions were. And so what you can see is in this picture, we started out with 15%, which is actually incredibly good. And it just slowly drops over the period of the study. And actually, maybe it's worth mentioning that originally, we had only the data from about here on. We only had 9 years of data. We got the budget and the resources to buy all the data going all the way back and test what we were doing in prehistoric times. And we discovered that we would have done way better had we been around at the beginning. But the thing that really struck us, and that I think substantially refutes the kind of things that, say, Gene Fama used to say, is, in the sort of stories that Kuttner said and Fama supports, they talk about markets quickly adjusting to inefficiencies. Whereas here you see over a 23-year period, we were still making extremely good profits at the end of the period with it, because we still had a correlation approaching 5%, which is actually quite good. Now, so this is a slow decline over a 23-year period. I would not call that a quick readjustment. Now, that said, this is a strategy that's technically hard to trade, actually even logistically hard to trade, and that's probably part of what's driving this down. In contrast, here's another, we divided the blocks of our model into what we called signals based on the inputs. This was, I can tell you, the stat arb signal. We had other signals like this one. Now, this signal is a bit different because it actually was not possible to formulate this signal until right about here. And after there, the surprising thing is the profits of the strategy actually grow through time. So this is a case where the market is not becoming more efficient, it's becoming less efficient. Now, that said, actually around here this peaked and then it went down again, and it's gotten relatively more efficient to this strategy. So